Kentucky, a land where rivers whisper secrets and borders are drawn by ancient currents. Nestled in the southeastern United States, this state is shaped almost entirely by water. To the north, the mighty Ohio River winds its way along the edge, meeting Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. To the west, the Mississippi marks a brief, yet powerful boundary with Missouri. But it's to the south and southeast, along the rugged mountains bordering Tennessee and Virginia, where Kentucky's hidden stories begin to unfold. Long before any Europeans set foot on this soil, this land echoed with the footsteps of indigenous peoples. Their ceremonial and burial mounds still rise from the earth like silent sentinels, remnants of civilizations whose names have been lost to time. But this sacred ground became a place of conflict. The Shawnee swept down from the north. The Cherokee rose from the south, each staking claim to Kentucky, not to settle, but to fight, to hunt, to survive. By the 17th century, whispers of Kentucky's untamed beauty reached the ears of French and Spanish explorers. They came quietly, drifting through the Mississippi Basin's veins, charting the unknown. By the early 18th century, traders from the eastern colonies slipped into the region through the Ohio River and Cumberland Gap, pioneers chasing opportunity in a land guarded by forests and shadows. European exploration stalled under the weight of native resistance and treacherous terrain. But in 1750, Virginian physician Thomas Walker led a daring survey party across these wilds. It was he who etched the Walker Line at 36 degrees 30 minutes north, a faint line that would later become Kentucky's southern frontier. Still, the land refused to yield easily. It took a war, the French and Indian War, to finally open the gates. The Ohio River, once fiercely defended, now flowed freely with settlers seeking fortune and farmland. And in 1769, a name emerged from the mist, Daniel Boone. With his hunting party, Boone stepped into the heart of Kentucky's Bluegrass region. By 1775, Boonesboro was born, a frontier outpost surrounded by mystery, resistance, and the promise of a new beginning. But this was only the beginning of Kentucky's strange, storied path to statehood. Kentucky history a dark and bloody ground. The land that would become Kentucky was not tamed easily. By the 1770s, settlers surged into the region, staking claims in the shadow of an ominous warning. Dragging Canoe, a Cherokee chieftain, had called it rightly. Kentucky, he said, would become a dark and bloody land. And so it did. The American Revolution unleashed chaos across the frontier. While British forces clashed with colonists in the east, they stirred unrest on the western edge, arming and encouraging native warriors to strike at the settlers. In 1777 and 1778, Boonesboro came under brutal siege. Then, in 1782, a harrowing ambush at Blue Licks ended in carnage, one of the last major battles of the war, and one soaked in blood. Yet the settlers endured. Smaller raids, sieges, and skirmishes haunted the backcountry, but the will to survive and to build was stronger. After the war, the trickle of immigration became a flood. Thousands journeyed down the rivers or crept through the narrow throat of the Wilderness Road, carved through Cumberland Gap by Daniel Boone himself. Harrodsburg, first called Harrodstown, rose near the headwaters of the Salt River in 1774, built by James Harrod and 37 determined men. Other towns followed, scattered across the rolling wilderness like seeds in fertile ground. And with them came the question, should Kentucky remain tied to distant Virginia? Throughout the 1780s, Danville hosted a series of fiery statehood conventions. Among them, a strange whisper, the Spanish conspiracy. General James Wilkinson and others allegedly plotted to turn Kentucky toward an alliance with Spain. It was a scandal cloaked in secrecy, and though it faded, it left a stain on the early political landscape. Still, the dream of independence from Virginia would not die. It solidified, and on June 1st, 1792, that dream was realized. Kentucky entered the Union as the 15th state, the first carved west of the Appalachian Mountains. Just 3 days later, inside a humble Lexington tavern, the wheels of state government began to turn. Isaac Shelby was named the first governor. A committee was formed to find a capital. They chose Frankfort. By November 1st, 1793, the First General Assembly convened, marking a new era, but shadows still lingered. In the years that followed, Kentucky's borders shifted. At first, the Ohio River formed its northern edge, while the Tennessee River cut across the southwest. Then, in 1818, with the purchase of far western lands, the boundary stretched to the Mississippi River, bringing with it more territory, more complexity, and more history to be written. This was no ordinary state. Kentucky was born of blood and betrayal, of untamed rivers and haunted forests. And its story had only just begun. Kentucky history divided loyalties and the shadow of slavery. By the end of the 18th century, Kentucky was a state at odds with itself. The events leading to its second constitution in 1799 revealed an internal fracture, one that would shape Kentucky's destiny for generations to come. On one side stood the small-scale farmers, self-reliant and independent, floating their goods, grain, hides, and hopes, down the Mississippi to the foreign-controlled port of New Orleans. They were pragmatists, but also idealists. Many stood against slavery, believing the institution threatened not only human dignity, but the very republic they were building. Opposing them were the powerful slave-holding elite, planters and businessmen whose wealth was tied to the backs of the enslaved. These men held sway over much of the state's political machinery and aligned themselves with the established order. Tensions escalated when the federal government passed the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, laws meant to silence dissent and stifle criticism. In Kentucky, outrage simmered. Among the voices raised in protest was a young politician who had come to define an era, Henry Clay. He opposed the acts not merely on political grounds, but as part of a broader vision, one that sought balance in the storm. Later, Clay would be remembered as the Great Compromiser, architect of the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1850, desperate efforts to keep the nation from tearing itself apart over slavery. As the 19th century dawned, Kentucky history entered one of its most turbulent and transformative chapters. During the War of 1812, Kentucky became a frontline contributor, supplying soldiers, leaders, and strategy in battles fought just beyond its borders. Many of its newly minted counties were named after war heroes, living monuments to sacrifice and ambition. The years between 1820 and 1850 brought the pulse of progress. A canal was cut through the stone at Louisville. Railroads crawled across the hills. Industry slowly awakened, and with it came culture. Portrait artists, silversmiths, and sculptors found willing patrons among Kentucky's rising elite. Yet beneath the surface, unrest festered. A post-revolutionary land boom had swelled hopes and prices. Independent banks sprang up like weeds, issuing paper money by the fistful. When the Panic of 1819 struck, those dreams collapsed into debt and despair. Fierce political battles over debtor relief fractured loyalties, pitting the Whig Party of Henry Clay against the rising populism of Andrew Jackson and his Democrats. But all these crises paled before the looming question, slavery. Though Kentucky's population of enslaved people never rivaled that of the Deep South, by 1833, nearly one-fourth of the state's people were black, most of them enslaved. The legislature passed a law forbidding the importation of slaves for resale, but true reform never took root. The wealthy planters of the Bluegrass and Pennyroyal regions held firm control over the state's political life. No constitutional change would be allowed to threaten what they viewed as property. As the North industrialized and turned toward abolition, Kentucky stood still, its economy, culture, and politics pulled increasingly toward the South. It was a land on the edge of a fault line, torn between identities, bound by contradictions, and haunted by choices it refused to make. And as the nation inched toward civil war, Kentucky's uncertain loyalties would be tested like never before. Kentucky history, a house divided in the long shadow of war. When a storm of civil war descended upon America, Kentucky stood in the eye of the tempest, divided conflicted, and caught between brotherhood and betrayal. In the beginning, the state clung to neutrality, echoing the legacy of Henry Clay, the great compromiser, whose final political act had been the Compromise of 1850, another desperate attempt to hold the Union together. But when war could no longer be avoided, Kentucky split apart. Roughly 76,000 men, some 15,000 of them black, took up arms for the Union, while 34,000 sided with the Confederacy. The battle lines weren't drawn on the map. They were drawn in families, churches, and town halls. Both Union and Confederate troops marched through Kentucky soil. The state was not spared. The Battle of Perryville, fought on October 8, 1862, became the largest and most decisive clash on Kentucky ground. After the Confederate retreat, open warfare faded, but it gave way to a darker, more insidious threat: guerrilla warfare, spreading chaos across the countryside. The war changed Kentucky forever. The end of slavery brought new beginnings for some, and bitter reckonings for others. The old Southern economy had collapsed, its market gone, its pride fractured. Kentucky, which had once relied on the enslaved and traded with the South, now found itself economically outmatched by the North, and geographically bypassed by waves of westward migration surging beyond the Mississippi River. Kentucky's untouched timber, its dormant minerals, had once seemed an asset. Now, they became a symbol of lost opportunity. The state, still rich in potential, was being left behind. What followed was a troubled and uneasy peace. New freedoms for the formerly enslaved were met with resistance and violence. The Ku Klux Klan spread terror across the state, working in shadows to suppress black voices. Though African Americans gained the right to vote and built new lives, often as tenant farmers or laborers in growing urban centers, the promise of equality proved hollow. Segregation was law. Racism was custom. Entire black communities formed apart, surviving in resilience, but never treated as equals. Cities like Louisville, Lexington, Paducah, Owensboro, and Covington expanded, fed by rivers and railroads. But in the hills and hollows, unrest simmered. Populist anger stirred among farmers, especially tobacco growers, who waged a silent war against the powerful tobacco trusts. Barns burned in the night, and masked bands demanded justice, or revenge. And in the Appalachian Mountains, a darker legacy took root. From 1865 to 1910, feuds and vendettas gripped the region, none more infamous than the blood feud between the Hatfields and McCoys. These conflicts weren't just family disputes. They became legends of lawlessness, painting Kentucky as a wild, untamed land. By 1900, as historian Thomas D. Clark would later write, Kentucky epitomized the conditions of an intensely rural agrarian state with a distinctively regional mindset. Kentucky was not merely a border state. It was a state torn at the seams, between North and South, past and future, loyalty and survival. And as the 20th century began, the ghosts of its divided history refused to rest. Kentucky history, struggle, steel, and the ghosts of the mountains. As the 20th century dawned, Kentucky stood at a crossroads, its economy diversifying, its people shifting, and its traditions being tested by the roaring engines of change. World War I cast its shadow far beyond the battlefield. In Kentucky, it lit a fire under the economy. Agriculture surged. Industry flourished. Coal boomed. In the dark hollows and deep seams of the Appalachian Hills, mining towns sprang to life, fueled by the world's insatiable hunger for power. Trains rumbled down newly built tracks. Automobiles roared across dirt roads. And after 1918, with the truck age rising, Kentucky's long-isolated communities were no longer hidden. They were connected, transformed, and exposed. But with prosperity came pain. In the 1930s, the Great Depression brought its heavy hand to Kentucky. Jobs vanished. Businesses crumbled. Farms withered. The same roads that had opened new opportunities now led thousands to distant cities in search of survival. Rural Kentucky, once the backbone of the state, began to empty. Yet even in the bleakest days, sparks of hope ignited. Through President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal, Kentucky became a canvas for renewal. Schools were built. Public halls rose from the ground. Roads cut through valleys and linked the forgotten corners of the state. Conservation programs reclaimed damaged lands, restoring not just soil, but spirit. But no program left a greater mark than the Tennessee Valley Authority, TVA. In western Kentucky, the TVA's grand vision came to life with the construction of the Kentucky Dam, a monumental project that harnessed the Tennessee River. It didn't just control floods. It brought cheap, reliable electricity to towns that had once lived by firelight. The dam was more than concrete and steel. It was transformation made visible. Still, not all was progress. In the coalfields of eastern Kentucky, a battle was being waged, not with rifles or artillery, but with strikes, boycotts, and picket lines. The United Mine Workers of America challenged the coal operators who ruled the mountains. What followed was a near decade of unrest, violence, and retaliation known grimly as the Harlan County War. It was a struggle not only for wages, but for dignity. In 1935, the Wagner Act changed everything. Signed into law by Roosevelt, it gave workers the right to organize and collectively bargain, tipping the balance of power in a region where fear had long silenced voices. Slowly, painfully, the war in Harlan County began to subside. But the echoes of that conflict, the desperation, the resistance, the resilience, would linger for generations. Kentucky in the early 20th century was a land in motion. The old ways were dying, but the new future was uncertain. As steel, coal, and politics reshaped its identity, Kentucky remained haunted by its past, forever poised between the progress it craved and the traditions it couldn't escape. Kentucky history, coal, collapse, and the fight for a future. As the smoke of World War II faded from the horizon, Kentucky stood at the threshold of a new era, one shaped not by muskets and horses, but by machines, electricity, and the quiet hum of television screens. The age of technology had arrived. Interstate highways sliced through the hills. Broadcast signals reached deep into the hollows. And by the 1970s, a nationwide energy crisis once again turned eyes toward Kentucky's coalfields. For nearly a decade, the black veins beneath the mountains flowed with wealth. Towns revived. Mines reopened. Hopes rose with the demand. But prosperity, as always, was fleeting. As petroleum prices stabilized, coal lost its grip. Layoffs in the automotive industry rippled outward, reducing steel production, and with it, the need for coking coal. Environmental regulations tightened, increasing the cost of coal use. And in a final blow, machines replaced men. Automation swept through the mines. Jobs vanished. Entire families were left behind. In eastern Kentucky, where farmland was scarce and factories few, the collapse hit hardest. For many, the poverty line was no longer a warning. It was reality. Agriculture, once the backbone of Kentucky's identity, had already begun to fade. From 279,000 farms in 1935, the number dwindled to fewer than 90,000 by 2000. Mechanization, labor shortages, falling prices, and droughts turned fertile soil into quiet ground. Even tobacco, long the crown jewel of Kentucky's crops, came under fire. Once synonymous with wealth and tradition, it was now condemned as a health hazard. Its future, like so much of the state's rural past, uncertain. But the story of Kentucky history is not only one of loss. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new vision emerged. Educational reform became a battleground for change. Industry expansion took priority. And in 1984, history was made again as Martha Lane Collins became Kentucky's first woman governor, leading efforts to modernize education and attract foreign investment. While some manufacturers departed for cheaper labor abroad, particularly in Mexico, Kentucky welcomed new players. Japanese automobile companies arrived, building plants, creating jobs, and planting fresh roots in a state long tied to the old ways. Kentucky had been scarred by war, shaped by coal, tested by poverty, and challenged by modernity. But through it all, it endured, never yielding completely to change, yet never standing entirely still. Want to uncover more hidden chapters of America's past? Subscribe to History Love for compelling stories, untold mysteries, and powerful journeys through time. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next episode of American States Unearthed. Your history, our history, deserves to be remembered.